Good morning, dear students. Let's begin our social science class. It's my third video, and today's contents will be France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. So in our today's video, we'll be going to understand that how does France abolish monarchy, and after that who took over the throne of France, and how were its laws implemented, and what were the consequences, and how does finally France become republic. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Although Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. That means that time Prussian kings were there. Louis XVI had a good friendship with them all. Although we know from our previous knowledge that France continued to be tense because the King Louis had already signed the constitution and he had agreed to the new policies that were made by the Third Estate, but now till now he was in the secret negotiation with the other kings of Prussia. Rulers of other neighboring countries who were worried about the development in France and made plans to send troops to put down the events that had been taking there since summer of 1789. So these were the policies of the other countries which they thought to apply to over the France. Before this could happen, National Assembly voted in April 1792. Now they had their own problems. They were to declare war against Prussia and Austria. Now these are the two countries which are neighboring of France. Thousands of volunteers thronged from provinces to join the army. They saw this as a war of people against king and aristocracies all over the Europe. They wanted the whole Europe to be democratic. They do not want the monarchical system of ruling to be established in the Europe, or they do not want this to prevail in remaining parts of Europe. Amongst the patriotic song they sang was Marseillaise. Now this is very important one mark question, which was composed by poet Roger de Isle, and it was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseilles. Now volunteers were the army people as they marched into Paris, and so got its name, the Marseillaise, and it is now the national anthem of the France. The Revolutionary Wars brought losses and economic difficulties to the people. Now this is another important question. Now you need to justify it, or either the question can come that how the Jacobin Club formation took place in France. While the men were away fighting at the front, now women, their responsibility, now they were left to cope with the task of earning a living and looking after their families. Large section of population were convinced that revolution had to be carried further, as Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer section of the society, and political clubs became an important rallying point for the people who wish to discuss government policies and plan their own form of action. And also over here, the important again question, the most famous of these clubs were of Jacobins, which got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Now so students, over here we saw that many of the large section of population had to be convinced that revolution as it is carried further, now they had to give some political rights only to richer section of the society which was already prevailing, and they need to change this according to Constitution of 1791, and that's why the political club formation took place, and it wished to discuss government policy and also their form of actions which they needed to apply to change these policies. And of them, the Jacobin Club was most famous, and over here convent, because its name was from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Women too had been active through this period, formed their own clubs. Now it was another different clubs of women which are formed, which we'll be discussing in section 4 of this further chapter. Now we will see composition of Jacobin Club, which is itself a question of 3 mark. The member of Jacobin Club belonged to mainly less prosperous section of the society. Now this we come to know over here. They were from less prosperous section or from third estate. They included small shopkeeper, artisan such as shoemaker, pastry cook, watchmaker, printer, as well as servant and daily wage workers. Now this was a composition of the Jacobin Club people. Their leader was Maximilien Robespierre. Now this is very important one more question, who was their leader and what was his further policies which led to his ultimate death. A large group among the Jacobin decided to start wearing long strip. Now their dress code was that they started wearing long strip trouser, which is similar to those worn by dock workers. And why did they wear such, or why did they decided to do such? This was to set themselves apart from fashionable section of society that were nobles who wore knee branches. Now nobles of the society, they wore knee branches and they were belonging from second estate. To differentiate them, they started wearing full stripped trousers, and it was a way of proclaiming the end of the power that was wielded by the wearers of knee breeches. Now these Jacobin came to be known as sans-culottes. Now this is culottes. This is the meaning which France meaning, which means those without knee breeches. Now as they were wearing full sleeves cloths, and that were different from those of second estate who wear the knee breeches, so that's why it was sans-culottes. Sans-culottes men wore in addition the red cap, which symbolized liberty, that we discussed earlier. And we discuss, students, this is also given on page number 13, the red Phrygian cap, which was a cap worn by slave upon becoming free. And here also Jacobin people started wearing that, but women were not allowed to do so. In the summer of 1792, the Jacobin planned an insurrection of large number of Parisians who were angered by a short supply and high price of food. On the morning of August 10, they stormed the palace of Tuileries, that is, massacred the king's guard and held the king himself as a hostage for several hours. Now why did they do so? Because they wanted some bread, because of the high prices of the food. They were unable to eat for a long time and they were very hungry. Also because of this, they could not carry out their regular life activities. That's why they need to do this. They had to attack, they had to storm the palace of Tuileries, and they had to massacre King Guard. Also they had to hold king himself as the hostage for several hours. Later the assembly voted to imprison the royal family and the elections were held, and now from all men of 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. Means whether they are paying the tax or whether they are not, they are having a right to vote. The newly elected assembly was called now convention. This is another important question, that what is a convention? On 21 September 1792, it abolished monarchy and declared France a republic. Now France was a republic, as we have seen over here. As you know, a republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including the head of the government, and there is no hereditary monarchy over there. Means we say that the monarchical system has been abolished from the France. You can try and find out some other countries that are republics and investigate when and how they become so. Now it is also of our India, which we'll be reading in our next class 10th, of the nationalism in India, that how we got our republic. Now let's see this. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. Now what is a treason? It is a betrayal of one's own country's government. On 21 January 1793, he was executed publicly at the Place de la Concorde. Now why he was sentenced to death? Because he had betrayed his own country's government, and Queen Marie Antoinette, which was her wife, met with the same fate shortly after. Now starts the Reign of Terror, which is most important and ironical situation in this chapter. We saw that the Jacobin Club and his head, that was Robespierre or Maximilien Robespierre, how they held various struggles and also they survived them, and finally they helped France to become a republic and free of monarchy. But now as he became a leader or a type of king of France, there he misused his powers. Now over here we will come to know that he became very strict, and those who did not follow his rules, even belonging to his own estate and his supporters also, he would punish them or he would guillotine them. Now guillotine is a type of device which consists of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. Also its inventor was Dr. Guillotine. Now what were the consequences of it? We will be reading here. Now the question was framed that what was the Reign of Terror, and who was Robespierre and what was his policy. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. All those whom he saw as being enemies of the Republic, like nobles and clergy, members of other political parties, even members of his own party who did not agree with his methods, were arrested, then they were imprisoned, and then they tried by revolutionary tribunal. If the court found them guilty, they were guillotined. Now, whatever if their mistake was identified, then they were guillotined instead. The guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. It was named after Dr. Guillotin, who invented it. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Now, he wanted equality, but for that he followed a different kind of path that was actually a strict and cruel path. Meat and bread were rationed. Peasants were forced to transport their grain to cities and sell it at prices fixed by the government so that everyone can get. But here also poor were in no advantage. The use of more expensive white flour was forbidden and all citizens were required to eat the pain d'eglise, or that is equality bread, a loaf that is made of whole wheat. Equality was also sought to be practiced through the forms of speech and address, and instead of traditional monsieur, that is sir and madam, which we use over there, that was a traditional sign which convey someone. Now all of them were called as citoyen or citoyenne, that is citizens of the France. Churches were shut down and their buildings converted into barracks and offices for the government purposes. Robespierre pursued his policy so relentlessly that even his supporters began to demand the moderation. Finally, he was convicted by a court in July 1794 because of the crime that he committed, and he was arrested, and on the next day he was sent to guillotine. Now students, you can see here we are discussing about the 17th century, which is a very common 1 mark question, that on which century this French Revolution and all the tragedy took place. It was of 17th century. So you can see India became a republic in 19th century, whereas France became a republic in 17th century, means about 2 centuries ago. That's why we can say that France is more developed than India. Now we will see a directory rule of France. Now here the question is formed is what was directory and what were its policies. Fall of Jacobin government because of the death sentence that was given to Robespierre allowed the wealthier middle class, wealthier middle class which were belonging to the third estate only, to seize the power. A new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertied section of society, means the one which did not have any property, they were not allowed to vote. It provided for 2 elected legislative council. These then appointed a directory and executive made up of 5 members. Now this was directory was an executive which was made up of 5 members, which composed of 5 members. This is itself one point. This was meant as safeguard against the concentration of power in one man executive as under the Jacobins, and however the director often clashed with legislative council who then sought to dismiss them. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. Because of often clashes or several clashes between director as well as the legislative council, now another leader who was coming in our way is Napoleon Bonaparte, and now his rise. Through all these changes in the form of government, the ideal of freedom, of equality before the law, and of fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movement in France and the rest of Europe during the following century. So we have discussed about till now how France becomes republic and what things that it faced during its republic movement. That's all for the day, students. Thank you and have a nice day.